Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. I want to talk about Pope Francis's comments that he made yesterday about Jesus Christ and the gospel, especially in light of his very controversial comments that he made recently about all religions being paths to God and being willed by God, and the diversity is willed by God, and they're all filled with richness made by God. And so, in light of some of those comments that he made, we're going to consider something that he said yesterday that you're probably not going to hear anywhere else. Because the truth of the matter is, report on these things generally only report on one side. They only report on controversial things that Pope Francis says, not the good things or not the clarifications that he makes. And so I want to bring to your attention something that you're likely not going to see elsewhere. And then we're going to take a look at his comments again in light of what he previously said. And we're going to consider, is he now backtracking? Is he contradicting itself? What's going on there? And then lastly, after that, I want to offer some thoughts on the notion of pope-splaining, as some people call it. And then I want to offer some challenges to the critics of the pope-splainers. So certainly stick around for that. All right, before we dive in specifically into what Pope Francis has said, I want to remind you, hit the subscribe button. If you have been benefiting from this channel, you appreciate the content here, take a moment out to just go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the like button for me while you're at it. Let me share my screen so I can show you what Pope Francis has said. We're going to take a look at what he has said, obviously in English. We're also going to take a look at the Italian and Spanish just to make sure that everything is consistent and that there's not maybe a difference in the translation. Okay, so this is again from yesterday, September 26, 2024, as you can clearly see right there. Meeting with the authorities, civil society, and the diplomatic corps. Address of His Holiness. This is the apostolic journey of His Holiness Pope Francis to Luxembourg and Belgium. So I'm not going to read through the whole thing. You're welcome to do that at your own leisure. I'll put a link to this in the description for the video. But let's hone in on the most critical part for our discussion today. Okay, so he says very, very clearly, as the successor of the apostle Peter, and on behalf of the church, which, as St. Paul VI said, is an expert in humanity, I am here to testify that the gospel is the life source. What life source is he talking about? Eternal life. The life source and the ever fresh force of personal and social renewal. It brings about harmony among all nations, among all peoples, harmony, and the ability to experience and suffer together. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ alone. Listen to that key word, alone. The gospel of Jesus Christ alone that is capable of profoundly transforming the human soul, making it capable of doing good, even in the most difficult situations, of extinguishing hatred and reconciling parties engaged in conflict. So he's saying the gospel is the life source. It's in the gospel alone that we receive this and that can transform the human soul that is in sin. May everyone, every man and woman in full freedom, so not just some people, may everyone know the gospel of Jesus, who has reconciled God and humanity. So this is not just some kind of social thing that he's talking about. It's not merely that. He's talking about a reconciliation between mankind and God. Why? Because there is a sin problem that humans have. And so, where's that source of life? Where's that source of reconciliation? He says it's in the gospel of Jesus alone, and everyone needs to be given that gospel, who has reconciled God and humanity in his person. That's in Jesus. And who, knowing what is in the human heart, can heal its wounds. So, again, we're not just talking about social healing. We're talking about healing of the soul due to sin. And that life source that brings the healing is Jesus Christ alone. Not one among many ways, not one among many remedies. Jesus alone brings that. And everyone needs to be given that gospel. He says the gospel is always positive. Now, just in case somebody wants to say, well, maybe they added that word alone or something like that. I'll point out here you see the Spanish. It says the same thing. And then here over in the Italian, you see the same thing. So it's not just in the English that you find that word alone. And that word alone makes all the difference. Because there are plenty of people who will say Jesus Christ is a way, Jesus Christ is a remedy or a means to God. But the Christian message is not that Jesus is a way, it's that he is the only way. Not a way, but the only way, the only remedy, our only hope. Our only reconciliation, he says, is the gospel of Jesus alone. Now, obviously, he's saying this when it comes to the timing. I'm sure for multiple reasons, one of them being in light of what he has said recently. And so in just a moment, we're going to take a look, is he maybe backtracking? Is he contradicting himself? Let me show you one other thing, though. Same day, he has another message. Meeting with a Catholic community, it says. Address of His Holiness at Notre Dame Cathedral, Luxembourg. So same day, a different audience. He's talking about the gospel. He's talking about preaching. He's talking about missionary activity. Then he says, firstly, your work reminds us of our responsibilities towards our common home, and that we must care for it rather than oppress it. At the same time, it also makes us consider that if we live out of this mission together, or live this mission out together, it will become a magnificent piece of music. We can sing in order to proclaim the beauty of the gospel to all. So the gospel is for everyone. It is also important for all of us to remember that what drives us to be missionaries is not the need to meet quotas or to proselytize. For Pope Francis, proselytism basically means using certain means that are evil in nature to try to get people to sign up for Christianity. Think of your Kenneth Copelands who try to manipulate people. That's what he's talking about here. But he says, but rather, our desire to make known to as many brothers and sisters as possible the joy of encountering Christ. And here I would like to recall a beautiful expression of Benedict XVI. The church does not grow by proselytism, but by attraction. Thus, as we overcome difficulties, the living power of the Holy Spirit is at work within us. Love moves us to proclaim the gospel, which opens us to others. Accepting the challenge of this proclamation allows us to grow as a community, thus helping us overcome the fear of embarking on new paths and to welcome gratefully each other's contribution. This is a beautiful, healthy, joyful dynamism that we would do well to cultivate in ourselves and among others around us. So what he is saying is there's clearly a very heavy emphasis in these two messages on preaching the gospel, evangelizing people, witnessing to people, missionary activity, bringing Jesus Christ to people, saying that everyone needs the gospel. Jesus is for everyone. This message is for everyone, and that it's in Jesus alone that we have that reconciliation between ourselves and God due to this sin problem that we have. It's in Jesus and his gospel alone that we receive this redemption. Well, he normally talks this way anyway. He normally says these things, but I do think that he is repeating them again in light of what he said recently, in light of the confusion that some of his words caused. I did 2 videos on them, critiquing them, showing what he said in fairness, what he said, what he probably meant, and then the problem with how he expressed it, and I offered some criticisms of it, and I stand by it. But now we have to ask the question, okay, is he just contradicting himself? Is he backtracking? Is there some way to harmonize what he had previously said with this? That's what we need to consider now. Now, for those of y'all who are just now joining in, hey, hit that subscribe button. I would really appreciate your support. If you appreciate the content here on the channel, if you've been benefiting from the material, take a moment out to just hit the subscribe button and the like button for me. Well, a lot of people aren't even going to hear this message. The people who have spoken about this issue with Pope Francis, the vast majority of them are not going to show this to you. It doesn't get the clicks. It doesn't help them with their agenda. They often, very often, many of them, use people for money. They use people for clicks. And if this isn't going to bring them clicks, they're not going to do it. If this goes against their narrative, they're not going to do it. They're not going to report on it. But for those who do see this message, and then they're wondering, okay, well, how does that work with what you said previously? I'm sure some people will think, okay, he's backtracking. Others will say, no, he's contradicting himself. You know, he speaks out of two sides of his mouth. He'll say, you know, on the one hand, one thing, and then he'll say something else contradictory to another group. They'll say he's a Peronist. He just tells people what they want to hear. I mean, obviously that's a possibility, but I do think that's unlikely. I think that there's probably some more reasonable solutions here. I previously critiqued what Pope Francis said because the way he expressed it was incredibly poor and misleading. I also critiqued him for not coming out and clearly correcting what he said and explaining what he meant. I did offer a solution on here's what he may have meant. What he may have meant is the good, the true, and the beautiful that you can find in other religions. That is a path to God. Well, yeah, okay. But that's not how the vast majority of people are going to take what you said, Holy Father. And that's the problem. What you may have meant is not what you actually said. A lot of people just rush to say, well, here's what he meant. Yeah, I understand that. I get that. But he didn't say that. What he meant to say, perhaps, is not what he actually said. And most people are just going to go with what he said, and that's the problem. And that's an error on his part, and he needs to correct that. He needs to come out immediately, the day of or the next day, and say, hey, sorry, guys, here's what I meant. So is there a way to maybe harmonize what he said previously with this? Yeah, but here's the problem. You shouldn't have to do that. He should come out immediately and very clearly say, here's what I meant. Is it good enough to just come out and say, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? No one comes to the Father except through me. You know, is it good enough to come out and say those things? In my estimation, no. It would be helpful if one does that, of course, but rather than just simply come out a week later and repeat the truth, it's important to come out, take some time, put it to the side, do a press conference and say, hey, look, guys, here's what I said the other day. Here's what I meant. and just very clearly make that known to people. Because here's what's going to happen. 99% of people who saw those headlines about Pope Francis and what he said, they're not going to see this. So really, it's not good enough to come back later, maybe a week later, and repeat the truth, because 99% of the people who saw the error are not going to see this. So while I think it's helpful that Pope Francis has done this, I don't think it's sufficient to address the issue. I don't think it's sufficient. Now, maybe Catholics have an obligation to share this as widely as possible. Sure. But even then, it's not going to spread as much as a controversy. So ultimately, what Pope Francis needs to do is come out and clearly say, hey guys, I affirm that Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. He's the only way to reconciliation with God. Here's what I meant the other day. He needs to do that. I don't think he's going to. I think this is the best that we're going to get. But this should alert people to the fact that it's a little more complex than they initially thought. As I actually showed people when he came out with those controversial statements, I said, well, it's a little more complex than you think, because Pope Francis said this about all paths being ways to God, and yet he's the same Pope Francis who says elsewhere, and I showed this to people multiple times, he elsewhere says Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and he's the only way to heaven. So either he's contradicting himself or he's poorly communicating something that is reconcilable, but he's doing a terrible job at doing it. So this isn't necessarily Pope backtracking. It's not necessarily the Pope contradicting himself. Could be those. A more likely solution is Pope Francis meant to explain the good, the true, and the beautiful that are found in these false religions. That can lead them to God, bring them closer to God, but salvation is in Jesus alone. Same thing that Paul said in Acts 17, but much more articulate. So it's not necessarily a contradiction, not necessarily a backtracking, but also I don't feel that this is good enough. I think it's a step in the right direction, what Pope Francis is doing here. I think it's helpful, but it's not good enough because most people aren't going to see this. I mean, honestly, consider this. This came out yesterday. Did you hear anyone else talk about this? Am I the first person you heard this from? If so, that tells you there's a problem. Because guess what? You heard about the controversy of what Pope Francis said on the same day that he said those controversial words, right? But now whenever you see something that doesn't fit that narrative, you didn't hear about it until I came on the air and told you about it. And then you're likely not going to hear about it from many other places elsewhere. You might see a few channels here and there, but it's going to pale in comparison to those who have reported on what he said the other day. And let's see how my words age here. Let's see if everyone in media proves me wrong. Let's see if all of a sudden later on today and tomorrow and the next day, people are going to report on this with just as much passion as they reported on the problematic statement from Pope Francis. And if they don't, what does that tell you? What does that tell you? You need to ask that question. What does that tell you about them as sources of information? Especially the Catholics. I don't expect non-Catholics to be balanced. I don't expect that. But the Catholics, if they don't tell you this side, what does that tell you about them? Well, speaking of which, I want to talk a little bit about the notion of Pope-splaining, because I've been saying a little bit about this lately. Before I dive into that, again, let me remind you all, hit that subscribe button and the like button. I would greatly appreciate the support. So I began to see some weird headlines everywhere beginning last week. You know, Pope-splainers admit defeat, admit the rad trads were right. And I'm like, when did that happen? Has anybody seen where that has happened? Can anyone produce a video clip of a Pope splainer admitting defeat, admitting they were wrong, admitting their whole narrative is wrong, admitting the Ratrads were right? When did that happen? I suspect what is happening is people think that if you criticize the Pope, that somehow means radical traditionalism is true. You know, the people who are saying the Pope is a heretic, he's evil, blah, blah, blah. You know, critiquing the Pope is not necessarily saying he's a heretic or admitting the agenda of the Ratrads. They're not necessarily the same. So I didn't see any Pope splainer admit defeat or anything like that. But what I'm seeing here is the very same people who are saying Pope splainers admit defeat, concede the Ratrads were right. These are the same people who've been lying for years about the Pope. These are the same people who've been spinning his words. I'm not talking about the times when Pope Francis himself is confusing. I'm talking about the times when he's clear, but people twist what he says. And to think that critiquing the Pope equals admitting that Pope splaining is wrong or admit defeat is the same kind of mentality that enables them to lie about the Pope every day, to completely twist his words. So I have a message to those people, the people who say Pope splainers admit defeat. Not only when did that happen, not only that question, but number two, I just have to point out, you really need to explain why someone should become a Catholic and submit to a Pope that you yourself claim is a heretic. If you're saying the Pope was a heretic, if you're saying he's destroying the church, if you're saying he's evil, you need to explain to people why they need to come into communion with him and submit to him in his papacy. Why would they submit to a heretic? Why would they submit to a wolf in sheep's clothing? Why would they submit to someone who doesn't believe the gospel? Why would they become Catholic to be led by someone who leads the Catholic Church who doesn't believe in Catholicism? You need to explain that. See, the Pope splainers aren't in the conundrum you're in, because the Pope splainers can fairly say, here's where Pope Francis is being misreported and call that out. And then elsewhere, fairly critique him and say, here's where Pope Francis can be critiqued. They're able to do that consistently. But the anti-Pope splainers, I don't think they're consistent. I don't think they tell the truth. And they certainly don't offer a positive case for Catholicism. They remind me of those Protestants who all they can do is critique Catholics and Catholicism, but can't offer a positive defense of Protestantism. Or maybe Muslims who do the same to Christianity, but can't offer a positive defense of Islam. We see this pretty often, right? Well, the anti-Pope splainers are the exact same way. They don't explain to us, okay, you say the Pope is a heretic, he's destroying the Catholic Church. So why should people join your church that you say is led by a guy who's being led by Satan himself and is trying to destroy the church and is a heretic? Can you explain that to us? They're, of course, not going to do that. They survive, they thrive on tearing down others, but they cannot survive on building a positive case for their own position. So that's another question that I have for them. Also, I would say you need to do some Bible splaining, anti-Pope splainers. You need to do some Bible splaining and Jesus splaining. I've done shows on this before showing a lot of difficulties with what Jesus says or what the Bible says. Now, I don't believe there's absolute contradictions here, but you got to jump through a lot of hoops to show that there isn't a contradiction. You got to do a lot of Jesus splaining and a lot of Bible splaining to hold the biblical inerrancy. I'm not saying you can't do it, but you got to do a lot of work to do it. And what I want to say is, rather than waste time on critiquing Pope splainers who are just trying to defend a religion that you belong to, are actually trying to help you out because you're supposed to be a Catholic, right? Rather than criticize the Pope splainers, please do some Bible splaining and Jesus splaining, because there's a lot of Muslims and a lot of atheists out there that see some really big difficulties with the Christian message. I'll give you just a few. Well, one that I've often pointed out: Jesus says he doesn't know the day or the hour of his coming. How does that work out in light of his divinity? Now, I've done videos answering that question, but no, I want to see the anti-Pope splainers answer that one. Here's another one. First Kings says that God sends a lying spirit into the mouth of false prophets to deceive people. How does that work in light of the claim that God is a God of truth? I mean, I have an answer, but I do have to do a lot of Bible splaining and God splaining to make sense out of that. God, according to scripture, it explicitly says God sends a lying spirit into the mouth of false prophets to deceive people. And yet I also say that God is a God of truth and not of lies. How does that work? I have a solution, but there's a lot of God splaining involved. So if you're bothered by Pope splaining, I just want to point out the inconsistency. Shouldn't you be bothered by the Bible splaining and Jesus splaining that you got to do in order to just be a Christian? Let me give you another one that's often overlooked. But of course, I suspect that most of your anti-Pope splainers believe that the Bible has been fully preserved, right? I don't know any Catholic, Pope splainer or anti-Pope splainer, who would say the Bible has not been fully preserved, God's word has become corrupt, hasn't been fully preserved. I don't know anyone who would say that. I can't think of any. So that's taken for granted. The Bible's been fully preserved, right? There's a very serious difficulty, however, that requires a lot of Bible splaining in light of 1 Samuel 13:1, where there is an incomplete verse here. The incomplete verse is absolutely nonsensical. It has Samuel being 1 year old when he begins to reign, which makes no sense. I'm sorry, not Samuel, but Saul. Other manuscripts, or I should say translations, try to replace it and say he was 41 or 40 years old when he began to reign. But that's a guess. No biblical manuscript reflects that, which is why some translations literally just have a blank at that point and just basically have a verse that is incomplete, that has been corrupted, because the biblical manuscripts don't actually offer a complete verse there. So unless you're going to say, well, that verse just doesn't belong in the Bible at all, you have to either then say, okay, it has become corrupted, because there's no biblical witness, there's no manuscript witness to any kind of sensical or coherent reading of Saul's age. You have to do a lot of Bible splaining, and you have to insert words into there that aren't reflected in any of the actual manuscripts. So it's a serious difficulty. I'm not saying there's not solutions. I believe there are. But I want to see the anti-Pope splainers offer a solution there, because any educated atheist or Muslim is going to bring that up. And as soon as you begin to try to offer an explanation, guess what you're doing? Bible splaining. And you got to jump through a lot of hoops and do all kinds of mental gymnastics, as the anti-Pope splainers call it. You got to do a lot of that to make sense of it. So if you're going to critique that in the Pope splainers, you got to critique that in yourself whenever you talk to atheists and Muslims about 1 Samuel 13:1. Let me give you another one. Been coming up actually recently in some debates on the Trinity. If you hold to an orthodox understanding of Trinitarianism, you believe all three persons fully God. The Father is fully God, the Son is fully God, Holy Spirit is fully God. Not a third, but fully. Each person fully God. And the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit, Spirit is not the Father. And yet there's not three gods, there's only one. So there's only one God, but each person is fully God, but each person is not the other person. Do you see how just logically most are going to come away saying, look, you either have to say this is each is 1/3, or you have to say this is a logical contradiction. You can't say what's a mystery, because no, mysteries don't involve contradictions. Now, believe me, I've listened to some really educated Christian philosophers who have offered a decent defense of Orthodox Trinitarianism in this objection. But guess what you got to do? You got to do a lot of Trinity splaining, don't you? A lot of Trinity splaining to make sense out of that one. So I guess that would be my message to the anti-Pope splainers lately, who have been trying to dunk on Pope splainers by saying they're admitting defeat. I just have to again ask, when did that happen? Number two, do you care to actually somehow offer a positive case for the religion that you hold to? Or are you literally just going to survive by attempting to destroy others and critiquing others? And then number three, I want you to show me how to defend biblical inerrancy, biblical preservation, the Trinity, Jesus and his divinity. Defend these things without Bible splaining, without Jesus splaining, without Trinity splaining, without having to jump through a bunch of hoops and make all kinds of qualifications and do all kinds of nuances. Let me see how you do that without doing all these explanations and nuances and qualifications. Show me how you do that. Well, I know you can't. So, okay, wait. If you get to qualify everything and nuance it and do this and do that, why do you have a problem when Pope splainers do that when they're defending your religion, your faith? Seems weird, right? Seems odd that there's actually a group of people out there whose entire survival exists on tearing down other people who are defending their very own religion. It's weird. Never seen anything like this. It's like it's suicidal. It's self-defeating, and it's hypocritical if you start to put their feet to the fire and tell them, defend biblical inerrancy, defend the Trinity, defend the divinity of Jesus in light of some of these questions. So I hope this was helpful to y'all. I hope that also reviewing what Pope Francis said was helpful to y'all as well, and gives y'all a little bit of hope and encouragement, and maybe gives you a fuller picture of trying to formulate a coherent position from Pope Francis. We have several options. Either Pope Francis doesn't have a coherent position, either he has changed his mind, he's backtracking, or he has a coherent position, but he is very poor at communicating it. I opt for that third option, and I have for quite some time. I think he's orthodox. I think he's very poor at communicating some points of theology, and I think he needs to do better in coming out and clarifying them. And so I'll say, hey, you know what he says here, it's a step in the right direction, but it's still not good enough. Need to come out and explicitly address the comments in some kind of press interview, conference, something like that. Address the issue head on. That will get a lot more media attention. Anyways, I hope it was helpful in bringing it to your attention, at least with my platform here. It's not as large as a lot of these other media outlets, but I do what I can. If you want to help me grow this outlet, grow this platform to reach more people, please hit that subscribe button. Please hit the like button, and consider supporting the channel at patreon.com/reason and theology so I can continue to grow what I'm doing here. Please help me with that if you feel that I've been doing good work. All right. Well, hey, thank y'all so much. Let me grab just these super chats real quick. Thank you so much, River Run. He says Pope Francis did good. Thank you for that. Shalom. Thank you here. Member for 10 months, please pray for my friend who's now set of a contest. I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, absolutely. Matthew Schmidt, thank you so much for that super chat comment. Pope Francis W. Again, it's a step in the right direction. It's helpful, but it's not sufficient, in my opinion. I think it's always sufficient to come out and address these controversies head on and offer clarifications head on and explain what you meant directly instead of people having to try to figure out what you meant. That's not fair to the people who are listening to you. And so I think he still needs to do that. But hey, it is a step in the right direction. It is better than nothing. But this is how Pope Francis has been all along. You'll notice he almost never comes out and clarifies his words directly. He'll usually address the issue a week later in a general audience, but most people don't see that. And I have to say, yeah, that's not good enough because most people aren't going to see it. Anyways, hope this was helpful. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. See y'all in just a little bit. Got another stream coming up here in 20 minutes. We're going to be going over that debate between William Lane Craig and Mohammed Hijab on the Trinity. So stay tuned for more. See y'all in about 20 minutes. God bless.